Sentry mode activated. Target acquired.
Hey there, Tarnished. Back here doing some more testing in Elden Ring, but kind of an actual factual testing this time, since we actually have files spilled out and all sorts of tools to verify information. So I wanted to take a look at arrows again now that I'm pretty much done with the New Game Plus no hit playthrough. I've been talking a lot with Titus, and we're realizing how bad some of these arrows are. So I went and checked arrow stats and damage just to see what was the most effective arrows, and I'm not sure how much of the clips are going to sync up to my actual dialogue, but bear with me please, because we're going to look at the damages, the stat it builds up, total DPS, and time to kill and stuff like that for most of these arrows. We're going to be testing here on Morgott in New Game Plus. Now, I decided to pick Morgott because he has relatively the same defenses across the board, at least according to the actual data mine values here on these spreadsheets, which I'm starting to be skeptical about. But it should be a really easy comparison regardless, because I mean, he should have the same defenses. And the New Game Plus cycles have slightly higher base defenses and thresholds as the game progresses, but they're not too much. Like, here are his stats in New Game Plus, and then plus and beyond that is +3 or 4 defense, so there's not too much of a difference. I'm also going to be using the black bow with 75 strength and dex, mostly because black bow is really the only bow to use. And if you're wondering why, it's because it does have the moveset of a short bow, but has the damage and range of a long bow. And barrage is also the best bow skill, so it's effectively 3 times the DPS when you're using it, so it's just OP. So anyway, let's just talk about the discoveries here. First off, I do want to start with the Stormwing Arrows. These are going to be the best physical arrows in the game, not by a lot, but by enough. And their special texts say that they do more posture damage, and when you look at the files, the only real difference between this and standard arrows, other than the 10 extra damage they get, is that the stamina damage increases, which makes sense. Now, what I find weird is that normal arrows do 5 stamina damage, which is basically nothing, and these do 45, which is a lot. But against bosses, posture damage is not a direct correlation to that. So the Stormwing Arrows deal 6 posture damage to Morgott, while regular arrows do 3. So it's double, but I don't know how the 9 times stamina damage formulates into this. I don't pretend to understand the damage formula, but again, Stormwings here, double posture damage and regular arrows, they're good. Now these arrows also hit pretty hard against Morgott. 357 damage is pretty good without having any talismans or buffs on. I am using this as the baseline for testing. Basically though, this is 37 arrows to kill Morgott, or 49 if you're using Barrage. Remember, Barrage has a 0.75 times damage multiplier. These arrows will generally be getting 1 posture break on a boss too, where most arrows probably won't. Next, we're going to be comparing these to Bleed Arrows. So the interesting thing that I noticed about arrows is that they do the exact amount of buildup that is stated on the equipment screen, which, I mean, it sounds obvious, but you'd think it would get some scaling with stuff, but it really doesn't. So Bleed Arrows do 55 bleed buildup, and I have fucking 19 arcane here. It doesn't change it. And that is against the target's resistance, which just changes its overall threshold cap, which obviously makes sense, it's like a player's. Now, enemies constantly recover their statuses as well, like players, so crossing thresholds can be fairly inconsistent depending on your timing and how, constantly you can throw arrows at them. Morgott, for example, would take 8 arrows to bleed just using regular shots, which have a 2-second interval, but Barrage only takes 10 arrows just because it bleeds so much faster. Even with the 0.75 times penalty to the bleed buildup, the boss recovers less because you're just hitting it more. Barrage is pretty nutty. So what we're looking at is how Bleed Arrows compare to Stormwing Arrows. Bleed Arrows themselves deal 298 damage, much less than Stormwing's 357, but the idea is that the bleed procs would outweigh the loss in damage. And against bosses like Morgott, who have pretty low bleed resistance, this is certainly the case, at least under ideal conditions. Morgott takes 1438 damage to bleed procs, and you can realistically get about 3 bleed procs in a fight if you shoot non-stop, making it take about 38 arrows to kill Morgott with just Barrage. Again though, that is assuming literally 0 downtime. Compared to Stormwing's 49 arrows to kill, Bleed is still crazy good, but it's not that much better considering Stormwings don't care about recovery at all, and Poise doesn't recover. And in practice, it would probably take you 41 or 42 bleed arrows to kill with ideal conditions. It's still better for sure, but not by a ton. Plus, then you gotta realize that the posture breaks or Stormwing Arrows gives you more downtime to get more DPS off. I mean, it's give or take. I mean, Stormwing Arrows are good is what I'm saying. So next we're going to be taking a look at the ice arrows. These are nice, but I've actually opted to use frost pots instead, since they do 300 frost damage instantly, which is typically 1 or 2 to freeze compared to 8 to 12 arrows. Anyway, Frostbite Arrows, they do slightly more damage than Bleed. Since they have 5 more attack, it's like 1 or 2 damage, big woo. But Morgott only takes 7 arrows to freeze, or 9 with Barrage, and the freeze proc hits for 933, but for 30 seconds after that, you get 20% more damage with pretty much everything. So freeze arrows themselves are decent, but their main use is just applying frostbite, so like bleed arrows, we need to compare the damage gained from the frostbite proc and the bonus damage for 30 seconds. Now using barrage, it does take 9 arrows to apply frostbite. With those 9 arrows and the proc, it's going to be 2985 damage. And then following that up with Stormwing Arrows, they now deal 323 damage during barrage. So against Morgott, it would take 32 more arrows to kill Morgott, totaling in 41 total arrows. It's slightly better than just using Stormwing Arrows, but still worse than just using Bleed across the board. So then what about Freeze and Bleed? Now unfortunately, the Bleed proc does not get boosted by Frostbite's 20% increased damage taken debuff. So using the same base 9 frost arrows and getting the proc, that's 2985 damage to apply freeze with those arrows, and then we're going to be following that up with Bleed. The Bleed arrows now deal 272 damage per hit, basically what Barrage Storming Arrows did before, but also have Bleed attached to them. So you're reasonably going to get 2 Bleed procs for the rest of the hunt, requiring you 26 arrows to finish off Morgott with a total of 35 arrows. This is definitely better than just Barrage Bleed arrows. But this seems all obvious, of course, that most people already know Bleed and Freeze are ridiculously strong against bosses, since they do percentile damage to them when they trigger. Some bosses though have really high Bleed or Frost resistance, in which case you might want to change arrows from Bleed and Freeze to Freeze and Stormwing, or just Stormwing. And that's pretty much it for the arrows you actually want to use. That does remind me though, we have to take a look at the other arrows. So other obvious ones are the dot arrows, Poison, Serpent, and Rot. So Poison and Serpent arrows are effectively the same thing. Serpent arrows are just better. They have slightly more base damage and more poison buildup, making them superior in basically every way, and you can just buy them from the merchant. The poisons they inflict are the same. Most instances of poison and rot do the exact same damage across the board. Poison is 7 plus 0.07% of their life as damage per second for 90 seconds. Then rot does 14 plus 0.18% of their life as damage per second for 90 seconds. It's really not a lot. And it takes about 10 arrows to poison or rot Morgott, and you're effectively losing 50 damage per arrow compared to just like throwing Stormwings at it, so that's 500 damage lost by the time you actually get the dot to apply. And then it ticks, and at least here on Morgott, for 16 damage a tick, it's going to require 31 seconds just to catch up to the initial loss of damage of just not using Stormwing Arrows. Now rot is twice as good, so it's only going to take 15 seconds to catch up, but it's still a lot of time on a boss fight. I don't think rot or poison arrows have much to offer compared to using just straight up Stormwing Arrows, unless it's against some very specific enemies that have a ton of HP, like Rykard, who has like 75k. He has 3 to 4 times the HP as almost any other boss, so the poison ticks are much better. Now the last arrows we do want to look at are the elemental arrows, Fire, Magic, Thunder, and Holy. And for the most part, these are just awful. They deal pretty much the same damage to Morgott as status arrows, like Bleed, even though Morgott has 0 absorb for all of these. Again though, I won't pretend to know how the damage formula works, because Thunder arrows are all over the place. For whatever reason, Thunder arrows have higher AR than all the other arrows, with no reason for it. The scaling doesn't change. I've changed my stats around, and I've changed other arrows to just give them lightning instead of whatever they have, and they get more AR. Don't know why. Damage formula is weird. Thunder's weird. But what I do know is that these arrows are still bad. Now when you have bows that have like 300 physical damage and then an arrow that does 90 of an element, which still has to be mitigated by the enemy's elemental defense, it ends up being the same as like 10 more physical damage on an arrow. Even against enemies that have more or less absorption, don't make taking elemental arrows worth it. Against Morgott here, who has 40% holy mitigation, holy arrows only deal 12 less damage than fire arrows, because the elemental portion of your damage is so tiny. And with going with the same logic here, if we're going against an enemy with negative 40 absorb to the element that you would use, it would only give you 12 extra damage. And even boosting it with talismans such as, the scorpions to boost fire or thunder damage, you're only boosting that 90 by like 12%. It's really tiny. It's much more effective to just run general attack boosts that tend to be 10% for everything, or even just 10% physical, which is most of our damage anyway. there's really not much of a reason to use most of these arrows. Now lastly, we do have sleep arrows. Hit and miss. Bosses can be slept, and most strong enemies that get slept just end up staggering for a brief second. It's not really a huge opening, and normal enemies that do end up falling over due to sleep have low enough HP that they just die before they get to sleep. So I'm not really finding a use for sleep arrows, to be honest. Anyway, with the testing done, I just have a few conclusions about arrows I wanted to share. First is that Stormwing Arrows are actually very, very strong, and if the target you're fighting is not able to be bled or has high bleed resistance, you definitely want to use these over bleed arrows or basically any other arrow. Frost arrows are good and definitely should be your first application if you have the opportunity. Always pair frost arrows with either Stormwing or bleed. However, I find that frost urns are easier to use since they are effectively 6 frost arrows per pot throw. And all the other arrows though, not really seeing much use for them. Again, more info that most people already know, but I just wanted to double check them, and I'm definitely going to be changing elemental arrows in my mod. But that's all for me though. Thank you all for watching, and good luck out there, Tarnished.